All right, there it goes. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Weren't the kids wonderful last time, by the way, last
They
month?
were.
Yeah,
They were great.
Fabulous.
And thank you to the library for the iPad, the stand, and also putting these programs out on the library's YouTube page. So if you missed it, be sure and go out. Even if you were here, go out and listen to it again, because Libby and the kids were wonderful. Okay, the first known burial was little Gracie Drips, who died in October of 1865. At that point in time, this area was largely ranch land, and I seem to remember that the Drips who lived in Empire were friends with the people who had a ranch down there, and that's how she happened to be buried there. The Masonic and Oddfellows Lodges designate the cemetery March 1869. I can't find record of that anywhere except in Louise Harrison's book on Empire and Birth and Past. But Louise Harrison was very good with her research, and I think that's probably a good date, March 69. The first known Masonic burial was Tyler Disbrow, who also lived in Empire. He and his brother owned mining property, the Conqueror Mine, outside of Empire. There was a fire. He ended up having congestion and died in August. In 1876, Henry Boyer, who was the local mortician, buys 6.69 acres from John Cross and William Jarvis. The cemetery he then names Glendale. And that makes sense, doesn't it? Hello. From the Colorado Miner in 1876, Henry Boyer did a wise thing for his own interests and a good act for the public when he purchased the beautiful tract of land at Alvarado and laid it off as a cemetery. The old graveyard below Stewart's, and that would be Stewart's Mill, roughly where the tennis courts are today. So the old graveyard below Stewart's is a bleak and desolate place and should have been abandoned long ago. I mean, it's only 1876. They haven't been here now. Glendale was originally laid off into 176 blocks, but the Catholic Church took 40, leaving 130 to be disposed of. The ground is admirably located for the growth of trees and flowers, as it can all be put under irrigation at a trifling expense. That didn't happen, but they were obviously thrilled to have this new location. And a few years later, they're talking about the old cemetery. This cemetery, well, those of you who grew up here remember it, would be in what's now Filing 4 of the Meadows. So start from the approximate area of the Silver Queen condominiums and head north along the hillside there. And that was the location of the old cemetery. November 1880, the article is The Unhonored Dead. The present neglected condition of the old graveyard lying immediately north of Georgetown is a disgrace to the community and must be distressing to those who know it as the last resting place of deceased relatives and friends. While it is no longer used as a place of interment, and this is 1880, while it's no longer used as a place of interment and many bodies have been removed to the cemetery at Alvarado, common decency, to say nothing of the finer sensibilities, demands that the scores of tenanted graves will remain there forever, should at least receive the slight protection of a fence. In its present state, it is a sad commentary on the evanescence, I don't know that word, evanescence of human affection. It is open to stock. The majority of the picket fences surrounding lots are torn down and scattered about, while costly marble headstones are thrown down and broken to pieces. The horrible suggestiveness of half-filled graves, whose unconscious tenants have been removed for reinterment, is painfully conspicuous. The mounds that mark the last homes of so many human beings are even now scarcely distinguishable. In the name of religion, civilization, and humanity, let something be done to mitigate this insult to the dead. So, needless to say, they didn't like that cemetery. But I was surprised they're indicating that it no longer was used in 1880. For those of you who grew up here, do you remember anybody being buried there? What happens with the development of the meadows is the remaining graves were disinterred and taken down to the area across from Alvarado Cemetery. There's a section that is enclosed in chain link fence. And there's a marker there just indicating that. I had I was the Registrar of Vital Statistics for a number of years, one of my stranger job titles. And at the county archives, we had the burial permits, which were when they were digging up the graves, and all they were really able to identify was body male, body female, or whatever. There was still a good number of people who had been interred there who were moved down. Okay, that's getting old. I digress. Okay, so in 1876, they're starting Alvarado. Boyer almost immediately sells land to Robert Morrison, and that section becomes the Knights of Pythias section, local fraternal organization. And then he turns around and sells land to the Catholic Church. In 1885, the Alvarado Cemetery Association is formed, and it is 4 people, one from each of the 2 Oddfellows lodges in Georgetown, and one from each of the 2 Masonic lodges. Now the first cemetery, I don't know if it was the Empire Masonic Lodge or the Georgetown one that starts it. One of these days I'm going to find more minutes. Danny Tomlinson, a lot of you know Danny, is very good at letting me read old minutes books. I have an exciting life, what can I say? Okay, so they form in 1885. Shortly after that, Senator Teller introduces legislation in Congress to transfer the lands for a cemetery, but that never goes through. Boyer transfers the land to 2 other local morticians in 1913, and then the Georgetown Masonic Lodge in 1926 acquires title to the land, to all of it, and I'll get back to that later. Okay, are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay, let's see. Okay, so I started off telling you about young Grace Drips, and she's buried in the section, all right, let me go back. Oh no, don't point at the screen, point at your, she is buried over, stop. All right. She's buried over here. If those of you who wander the cemetery know where Buff and Mary Lou are buried, she's buried, she and Tyler Disbrow are both buried over here, close to the mountain. And this is her tombstone, Little Grace. And then this one is Tyler Disbrow. I put this picture in here because the only reference I found to her parents was that her father was a member of the militia in Empire, so I'm sure he's standing right there. And this is the 2 graves together with Little Grace here and Tyler off in the distance. I know, they're so young. People refer to this as the Georgetown Cemetery, but there are people from all parts of the county who are buried here. These 2 are the Coburns, and the Coburns were Lawson. And this is little, I think her name was Puss Lawson. Yeah, you've seen that one, yeah. The daughter of Alex Lawson of the town of Lawson. No, don't point at the screen. I know it feels like it's up there, but it's not. It's over here. So the Grand Army of the Republic is were the owners of that section. As you walk in, and go up the hill to your left, you'll see all military stones in that area. That was an area dedicated to the Grand Army of the Republic. Georgetown had the first group. It was Sheridan Post number 2, which was the first one in the state of Colorado. Don't you like that? Confused the state archives for a while. Because it was the Grand Army of the Republic Department of Colorado and Wyoming. So post number 1 was Wyoming, post number 2, Georgetown. And was renamed Thornburg. This photo, Paul Conway, those of you who are out on Facebook a lot will come across Paul Conway. He posts great things, and he gave me this. Oh, no, he didn't stop. Down there. It's going to be recorded. People are going to be listening at this. Why does she keep going? Stop, wait, stop, wait. This is a picture of all of the old boys from about 1882, the members of the Grand Army of the Republic. I think that's Hamel. I can't prove it, but I really think it is. So some of the vets who are down there include John Tomei. You all know him because of the library next door. He was a very dedicated member of the post, and he continued through all the years and Memorial Days and parades and everything else. And as part of his will, he indicated he would like to be buried in the Grand Army section, and he was. Now his this tombstone, so this is his. He has two. He's got the block here, John Tomei, 1845 to 1922. It says IORM, which is the International Order of Red Men. And down here, his military marker, which has Tomei spelled Tuomey, which makes me wonder if maybe he pronounced it to me. Can't prove it? There you go. So he is in that section. And then those of you who've been coming through the years know I tend to talk about this gentleman a lot. This is Charles Oscar Townsend, was a black man, actually mulatto, born in Alabama, and his father was also his master. He had been born into slavery. His mother was a slave, his father was the master of the plantation. He comes out here and is a barber through the years. He was a member, if you look at his tombstone when you're down there, Charles O. Townsend, Company B, 5 U.S. CHHA, United States Colored Heavy Artillery was the unit. So that's Oscar or Charles. Then as you go down towards the Glendale section, we're looking, actually, directions, right? We're looking west. For descriptions of Alvarado, they normally say the interstate would be north, Saxon Mountain south, and Idaho Springs east, and what I call Sam and Danis, but Stan Moore's house would be down at the end down here. Yeah. As you start in here, you come across one of the people I always stop and say hello to. But before I show you his marker, when I was doing research on 20th century Georgetown, 1918 was just a depressing year. It was, the church had burned, and the pandemic, the flu epidemic, World War I, and I came across this article which included the words "to in Flanders Fields." In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. This makes me cry. We are the dead, short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders Field. So I had to bring that. This photo is of the local boys, or some of the local boys, leaving at the depot in 1918. This is the Alpine, the depot. And how many of you used to get poppies? My mom, yeah. We did every year, and they called them buddy poppies. It was done as a reminder of veterans and a reminder of Memorial Day. And anyway, so I just wanted to put in a buddy poppy. Because down here we have the grave of Walter Oakland. And Coraloo, where are you? Did you know some of the Oaklands, Coraloo?
She was my first grade teacher.
I thought so, yeah. Well,
first and second, maybe third.
Probably his sister, I would guess. So this is Walter Oakland, and this is also him. He worked at the Capitol Prize Mine. And this is his, and he's the first one of Georgetown to die, and he died in France. Telegram was received last Saturday by Mrs. Oakland from Washington, announcing the death of her son, Walter Oakland, who died in France on October 5th of influenza. Walter Oakland was born in Georgetown, September 1890. He registered June 5th, 1917. Was called into service July 18th, 1918. He was first attached to the infantry, but just before he left for France in September, he was transferred to Medical Replacement Unit 44, survived by his mother, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, all residents of Georgetown. But how close to the end of the war, and he's taken. And then there is Arthur Johnson, and he would have been Wilma's uncle, matter of fact. Nice looking young man. He dies, according to his marker here, he dies November 12th, 1918. So you know what November 11th, 1918 was. So he also dies, I believe, of the flu. But to be his parents and think that your son had made it through, the war was over, and the next day he passes. He's buried with the rest of the Johnsons, those of you who wander the cemetery up more in the Masonic section. And then there's William Spruance. This is one of the markers that I direct people to a lot when they would come and say, where's so-and-so? I said, well, you go in, and you go out and you turn right. And then you turn right again and you look for this. But William Spruance was a veteran of the Mexican-American War, 1848. He was also county clerk, and he ran the store Spruance and Love being my great-great-great-uncle. But he apparently had quite a temper, which may be why Uncle Joe and he broke up their partnership. But anyway, so that's William Spruance. I think he's the only Mexican War veteran in the cemetery. And Dr. Pollock. You know, when you study history, there are people you just tend to like. And Dr. Pollock's one of them. I can't tell you why, I just always thought he was an interesting character. He built this house on Rose Street. I see Kathy's here and Mike and Janice. That's your neck of the woods. He built that house. And his tombstone, he's got this and also the marker for his young son here. He was a surgeon in the 2nd Colorado, and they fought in Missouri and Kansas. He dies in 1882, fairly young. He married 1872, I think. His wife was referred to as Jenny. She's got 2 or 3 names. Her father was a Confederate general, which is sort of interesting. And she was from North Carolina and never figured out where they would have met, but saw an article later where it indicated, so he had been a justice of the peace in North Carolina. I have no idea when. He comes out to Colorado before the Civil War. He's over in Leadville. He's writing articles on mining at high altitude. Anyway, just an interesting soul. And a great picture. Then Jesse Jones is a Confederate soldier. He's buried up in the Masonic section of the cemetery. Jesse P. Jones, old resident of Georgetown, died December 31st, 1904, after an illness of 2 weeks. Mr. Jones came to Georgetown from Missouri about 24 years ago, has ever since made this place his home. For many years, he followed the vocation of mining. Served as a member of the Board of Selectmen from 1888 to 1891. 1895 was elected county assessor, which office he filled until 1899. During the War of the Rebellion, he served in the Confederate Army under General Price. Leaves a wife and 2 daughters. Funeral was held Tuesday afternoon, Methodist Church, under the auspices of Washington Lodge number 12, AF and AM, the Masonic Lodge, and he's buried in the Masonic section of the cemetery. Then I had to put in the editors. I mean, I know I said it was going to be veterans, but as I was looking at different slides, there are a bunch of editors down there. So we have over here, and these are all in the Masonic section of the cemetery. We've got Charles Bellamy here, who was a veteran. That's how I ended up in this. E.H.N. Patterson, who was known locally as Snicktaw. Jesse Randall, the editor of the Georgetown Courier. Reuben Weiser, who's an in-law of my family, so I like Reuben, keep track of him. and then Carrie and Carol Stiff. But the interesting thing about Bellamy and Patterson, so Patterson, they talk about, did I print him out? Oh yeah, I did. Hello, how are my eyes? So Patterson well, his father had run a publication in Illinois. Oh, Mark and Karen, you're here. Okay, do you know how to pronounce Oquaka? Aguaca? It's Illinois. Sounds good to me. I know I went to a school named Irondequoit. I know how this works. So in his obituary, well, they talk about the fact that he was a writer of prose and poetry of very high order, always unassuming and modest. I have read that he and Edgar Allan Poe were going to be producing a journal together, so I mean, he was a pretty good writer. So poor Mr. Bellamy up here, who takes up after Patterson, when he dies, they say, Mr. Bellamy, although by no means remarkable for ability as a writer, was a man of sound judgment. And come on, it's an obituary. This is like writing an obituary that said, well, you know, she didn't use the Oxford comma. So Mr. Bellamy. Reuben Weiser, up here, had the Colorado minor for a few years. He was a reverend, and he lived over in Georgetown. The Reverend Weiser and his son had the house where Cindy Neely lives, and right next door, Elizabeth Richardson's house. So those were the Weisers. And then down here on the right are Carrie and Carol Stiff. So it just seemed interesting that we had a bunch of editors. So I put them in because it's my program. So then when we started off, I had that picture here, and this is just one because I thought it was interesting to find them, having seen that historic photo. This grave and area still exists. It was for Willie Woodward, who dies June of 1880. I think he was 10 years old. He'd been playing in the, like a blacksmith or stable area, and something came loose and crushed him against the wall. But he's buried, okay, I'm gonna put this down. Let's see if I can do this without, okay. So he's buried here, and these are his parents, Thomas and Augusta, who are interred with him here. So it's just, if you walk down there, say hi to the Woodwards. And the Woodward name shows up in Silver Plume with Woodward Street, and I'm assuming there's a relation, but I'm not sure which Woodward the street was named after. So trying to mark lots and blocks to find unmarked graves. Should be simple, right? It's not. So, Bruce did a little photo bomb here. So say hello to Bruce Wayne. Danny Tomlinson brought me a couple of books that were stored over at the Masonic Lodge here. One of them was for the Glendale Cemetery going up to 1907, the other one for the Catholic Cemetery. And they have things like this where they're writing which block number and which name. And that's fine, but there's nothing that gives us a starting point. You know, just to keep it fun. So I had to find something that was on the list. And Mr. Peter Borka is here. And he and Cecilia Morrison are there, and they appear to be where they're supposed to be. This is good. And if, perchance, if this happens to be a 6x6 plot, I'm going to be really happy. Frank lent me his measuring tape, but I haven't gotten down there with it because it's been raining. So we've got Peter Borkan and then Cecilia Morrison. And we've got, so they would be in the third row back from the start of the Catholic cemetery. The first row, just to the west of the Catholic cemetery, includes all of these wonderful, delightful scribbles. And it makes me think that each of these lots, so there are 4 lots in a block. I think the lots are 12 feet, because they talk about both 3-foot and 6-foot graves. Most of the African Americans who are buried in Alvarado are buried in 3-foot graves. But I think it may just have to do with cost, I'm not sure. So I made notes of all of the 3-foot graves, and when time allows, I'll go back and figure out if this is something, and it would make sense for a children's interment or others. But we have all of these where we've got to figure out who's buried where. Now, this piece here was interesting to me as I was looking at it, because I was seeing all of these 3 feet, and that toward my interest. And I came down here, and I was looking at some of these names, and we have here, we've got Patrick Barrett, okay? And if you remember from 2 months ago, 3 months ago, with the discussion of Silver Plume and the fire in Silver Plume, Patty Barrett was the one killed in the fire on Main Street. So here's a Silver Plume burial down here. And right below him, Robert Bush and Charlie Vance. Now, it would appear that it's Robert Bush, C-U-L-L-A-R-D, and Charlie Vance, C-U-L-L-A-R-D. The Fort Lewis students put in C-U-L-L-A-R-D as their last name. It's not. It's not a surname, it's their ethnicity. And if you spell like I spell, you pick that up in a heartbeat. Okay, so these are, this is Robert Bush colored and Charlie Vance colored. But I recognize the names of Bush and Vance from other research, an article in the paper. The colored citizens of Georgetown desire to express their sincere thanks and profound feelings of gratitude toward Mr. W.A. Hamill and his wife in coming to their assistance in the time of need without solicitation or any signs of reluctance, in aiding them in burying their countrymen, Robert Bush and Charles Vance. And if in the future an opportunity ever presents itself wherein they can assist their benefactors in any manner, they will not be found ungrateful. So I remembered that. Anyway, so I've got to go back in and change the index, give them their real surnames. Yes, and then the Catholic section, the records of internment, the Catholic section. I love this because somebody obviously took the book out in the rain, you know. So this was a well-used book. So they started off with this page that has the different blocks, and the blocks each have 4 lots. This piece up here, north, would be up towards Alvarado Road. And the numbers start up there with 1, 2, 3, and 4. And as we come down here in that first section, we've got Owen Feenan and Mrs. Margaret Feenan, and they're Silver Plume. But what we don't know is if people were actually buried here. Did they just buy the lots or reserve the lots, or are they interred there? Oh, wait. So, apparently, sometime in the 1920s, there was a fire in the vicinity, and a lot of the wooden markers were burned. So it might be possible to find that there are still markers at the heads of these graves. I haven't quite figured out, if I go down, if I get arrested at some point down, because I'm down digging in the cemetery, looking to see. But it would be very helpful to know if these really are occupied graves or not. If Phil and Sally were here tonight, I was going to ask them, because the first row of the Catholic graves, I believe the first row includes Ethel, Gwinnella, it's either Sturm or Strum, and I wondered if they ran into any extra residents as they were putting her in, because I think that those are right about here. So, and more to follow. So then the Washington Lodge comes in and they get a patent for the property. And the newspaper comments on that. A movement is underway to acquire the cemetery grounds at Alvarado before some crook comes along and locates it as a mill site. The Masonic and Oddfellows Cemetery Association was incorporated in March 1885, but no attempt made to acquire title until Senator Teller introduced a bill in Congress May 1888 to set a tract of land aside for a cemetery. For some unknown reason, the bill failed to become law. So it's 1926, and Alvarado is the only cemetery of size in the county that's not included in a town site patent. So Silver Plume Cemetery, and Silver Plume Cemetery, by the way, Silver Plume residents are using Alvarado until about 1886. And then the local cemetery in Silver Plume starts to become a place where they're using for local burials. But the Silver Plume Cemetery is within the boundaries of the town of Silver Plume. The same for Empire, the same for Idaho Springs. For the Dumont Cemetery, the town of Dumont was never incorporated, but the residents of the town of Dumont applied for a town site patent from the federal government. Remember, this is all just federal land when people come out here. It's all part of the Louisiana Purchase. So the folks in Dumont applied for title, and the judge of the county court then deeded out properties to people. So this land, which isn't part of a town site patent, really was just out there, and if somebody had wanted to apply for title as a mill site, they could have, and they could have just sort of dug the folks up. Would have upset people, but anyway, so that was the reason. And thank you to the Masons for starting all of this, or in 1926 stepping up. And those of you who knew our friend Ned Biggs, the number of years that Ned was involved in acting as a sexton down there was a labor of love, to say the least. So that's why the title to all of the land down there is the Georgetown Masonic Lodge. I had thought it probably had to do with the building of roads and highways, because it was obvious that they were going to start coming in and widening, but the newspaper says it was more concerned about possibility of somebody buying it as a mill site. So the Masons buy it, and county surveyor Percy Barber was also the county surveyor. So he decides to start making sense of this. Doesn't this look like fun? This is why we say thank you to the students of Fort Lewis, because it was a mess to try and pull it together. At this point, I think we're looking at trying to find ways to mark the corners of the different plots, the lots, and label some other things. It's going to take time, but at least we've got a starting point. Because again, so they went from this and saying, well, you know, Henry Boyer had this piece, and Henry Boyer had this piece, and here's St. Mary's, and all these things have numbers on them, but there isn't anybody buried there, and it says anyway. It was a mess, so it's getting better. I wanted to finish up with some talk about Decoration Day, which has changed. It's called Memorial Day now. But in May 1868, General John Logan proclaimed a National Day of Remembrance, and quote, "The 30th of May, 1868 is designated for the purpose of strewing with flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in defense of their country during the late rebellion, and whose bodies lie in almost every city, village, and hamlet churchyard in the land." And I think General Logan is of particular interest. He owned mining property above Silver Plume. And I've also wondered if maybe that's why we became GAR Post 2. Maybe it was with his urging. But so I put a picture of the good general there. Generals Logan and Custer both invested in mining in Clear Creek County. Custer invested in the Stevens mine of Stevens Gulch. Generals Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan visited Georgetown in 1868. And for a fun project sometime, if somebody's looking for a fun thing to do, it'd be interesting to find out what generals were involved where. Yes, we got two of the biggies there between Logan and Custer. So the celebrations that they had in town for Memorial Day were really big in the 19th century. And one that I'll give you some information on from 1881 that's labeled Honoring the Soldier Dead. The beautiful customs of decorating the graves of soldiers and honoring the day set apart for such services was almost universally observed in cities, towns, and hamlets throughout the country. Before the close of the war, it became the custom in many places for families and friends of those who were killed or who died in the army to decorate their graves with flowers. In 1866, the custom began to assume a public form, and today is set apart as a national holiday. In our own little city, there was almost a universal acquiescence with the request that business places be closed and all take part in commemorating the brave silent majority. The sun came out bright and warm, which soon caused the snow which had fallen the day before, yeah, we know this, the snow which had fallen the day before to fast disappear. And by noon, the streets were almost dry. At 10:30, the Grand Army boys, they marched to the Opera House. The memorial services at the Opera House were opened by music and by the band and glee club, prayer by Reverend Libby. Honorable J.B. Belford then delivered an oration entitled "The Peerage of the Immortals." They printed this oration in the paper, and it was 4 columns long.
Wow.
I decided not to read it tonight. But it makes you realize why the people were so impressed. One of the reasons with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was in an age where everybody gave huge, long orations. The Gettysburg Address was nice and concise. At the conclusion of the address, the glee club and school children rendered some excellent and appropriate music. A little past 1 o'clock, a train of 8 cars, all filled, left the depot for Alvarado Cemetery for the purpose of participating in the decorating of the graves. 8 train cars. Members of the Thornburg Post decorated. The graves of Matt Sandels and Dan Hume, who served in the Confederate Army, were also decorated. So interesting that really by 1880, things are quieting down to a certain extent. By the time you get into the 20th century, these are much smaller celebrations, of course, and the old fellows are passing away. And so by the time you get into World War I, it's probably maybe 5 or 10 members of the Post who are still here. So, to wrap this up, then becomes, where do we go from here, right? And we don't know the names of all of the veterans buried at Alvarado, and I put up here, this is Larry Jumps. And Larry was a member of the 10th Mountain Division. I know that my dad always told me about the 10th Mountain guys, so Memorial Day, if I've got an extra flag, I make sure it gets put up at Mr. Jumps' grave. But most of the World War II veterans who are down there, they would have served, but they don't necessarily have military markers. And so something that, again, another project that would be interesting would be to go through all the names and find out who served and make note of that. Especially once we are able to determine who's buried where. Or we know where they're buried, we just don't know quite what to call it. This marker is down in the Glendale section, and I wonder if this relates to smoke from that fire. I haven't gone down with 409 or anything to try and figure it out. But so that becomes the next part of it really is, if we can figure out, get a general idea of the unmarked graves down in the cemetery. And then up here, I put up findagrave.com. Have any of you used Find a Grave? If so, you're genealogists, I bet you anything. Find a Grave is pretty amazing. If you do genealogy, and if you happen to use Ancestry, when you're doing genealogy and you put your family tree in and the little green leaves pop up, telling you here's a hint for you. As often as not, if there is a marker somewhere in the US that relates to that name and date of death, they'll pop it up with a link to Find a Grave. I was surprised as I was going through the Alvarado records on Find a Grave, because they have all of the names of all the surface burials down there are on findagrave.com. And I was surprised because this is a picture of my dad. And I was going through and I said, who put that there? My brother doesn't have computers. But Find a Grave was purchased by Ancestry. So if you have if someone in your family tree has done a family tree that's posted on Ancestry, then chances are it will pop up. And I was surprised to discover that not only did my dad and his picture show up, and there's his marker, he was a lieutenant colonel, World War II, and that's my mom. But then there are links to his grandparents, and then you link on those, and it takes you to the cemetery in Iowa City, and it links on something else and just keeps going. So Find a Grave is very interesting. What intrigues me is the fact that we could put locations on the Find a Grave. So we could either put it down by plot, lot and block, or we could put the GPS marking in there. So all we need is free time and a bunch of interns, and we can get it done. And this is just, once again, I had to say the other part of this is let's figure out who's buried where. So anyway, hi, that's what I have to say tonight. And does anybody have questions? Mark?
Christine, Walter Oakland, who said after his service he worked at the Capitol Prize.
Yeah, he did.
You know what he did?
He was a miner.
Who that was, or what his occupation was?
He was a miner at the Capitol Prize, so he's, let's give him back to here. Come on, Walter. Couple more. One more. So he's in this picture, which is the miners working the Capitol Prize, and he's number 2 there. It's this gentleman, so he would have been a miner up in your neck of the woods. Yep. Dennis?
I had heard once that there was a Jewish section of the cemetery. Is that true?
No, it isn't. The Jewish, for the January program where we talked about Jewish virgins, the Jewish community were buried in Denver, usually associated with the Jewish section of the Fairmont Cemetery, which was Congregation Emmanuel. So the merchants that I know who were living here were either buried at the Fairmont area, or some of them had returned to New York and were buried in Jewish cemeteries there. All right, there's going to be a test on this. Is that it? Yes, ma'am.
Christine, what was you mentioned something about the Society of Red Men?
The International Order of Red Men was a fraternal organization. The same Knights of Pythias, Red Men. The cemetery in Silver Plume has a Red Men's section. They were fraternal organizations formed both for meetings, a way to get out of the house, and generally they also gathered money that then went to widows and orphans upon the death of. So when I was talking to a gentleman in Denver who has lots of books on some of the original records for the Knights of Pythias and our local Georgetown and Silver Plume, but a lot of other ones too. But he looked at me and he a little bit of a grumpy Gus. But he said, well, you know, government got rid of all of this. And I'm like, well, he said, well, when they formed Social Security, these fraternal organizations went out of business. And to a certain extent, that's true. But anyway, he kind of wanted me to start up a new chapter of Knights of Pythias. I don't think so. Tom?
Do you know about when that photo was taken?
This one would be, I think it's like 1914.
Okay.
He just looks so calm and relaxed, doesn't he? I have no idea what was coming.
It looks like it's been
Holly?
Do you have any idea of the names of the people who were moved to that little plot
No.
within the
No,
fence
I sure
area?
wish I did. I've seen the names of 4 or 5 people who had been, 4 or 5 veterans who were buried at that old Georgetown cemetery. It included Colonel Hale, who's the one who platted out Elizabethtown out of the same town and dies in 1869. But no, sure don't. But see, there's a book someplace. I'm searching, aren't I? I want to get into the I want to go to the safe.
Something in
Somebody.
the back of my mind says that when I-70 was going through, some graves were
Yeah.
moved. And what you said today makes much more sense.
This stuff, so there are a couple of books that I think have to be out there. And one of them is The Town Cemetery that was in the Meadows. And I think about Bernard Buckley, and I think about George Rowe, and I think about the safe over at the Masonic Lodge, and it wouldn't surprise me if those are there. So every time Danny digs around and comes over to the second floor of the archives and says, I found these, it's like, but so far have not found the one that does that. Interestingly, they got most people there, but every once in a while, when I was in the basement of the courthouse, people would come in and say, we're putting up a new house and they found this and who is it? And it's like, I don't know. But anyway, were you one? Yes. Yeah. Anyway, that's it, guys. Have a nice summer. Thank
Now I have to turn this off.
Also, I want to mention to everybody, please help pick up your chairs, but also there's the red can back there to help for a little dividend if you'd like